Tiny little houses. Right.
Thank you, Ollie. Welcome everyone to the data panel. So today we're going to have about 90 minutes or so of session, which includes a couple of presentations on data efforts here in Richmond with the help of some of our non-profit partners. And also we have special guests from Urban Institute who has come here to present their upward mobility framework initiative. So we'll be talking in detail about all of those. But before that, let me introduce my panelists and the moderator. Today's panel will be moderated by Audrey Trussell from Community Foundation. She is a very old friend of PlanRVA. And then on the panelists, we have Alexis Weaver from the Urban Institute. She flew from Atlanta to participate in this event. And then panelist 2, we have Isabel Eljaiek from Community Foundation and Frank Cardella. Cardella from the United Way of Greater Richmond and Petersburg. So I hand it over to Audrey to make a slightly extended introductions, and the panelists will be presenting their making their presentations. Thank you, Audrey.
Thanks, Aaron. A little bit shorter. There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Give it back. Come on, give it back. It's after lunch. One more time. Good afternoon, everyone. We're talking about data. There we go. All right. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Audrey Trussell. I'm the Vice President for Community Impact at Community Foundation for Greater Richmond, and my pronouns are she, her. We're really excited to delve into a critical and timely topic today: the role of data in improving economic mobility outcomes within our community. Our discussion today will be guided by insights from a research expert at the Urban Institute who brings best practices from their comprehensive upward mobility framework. This framework is designed to enhance our understanding of the multifaceted challenges and opportunities related to economic mobility and to provide actionable strategies that can be implemented at the local level. We're also joined by data leads from PlanRVA, the Community Foundation, and United Way, who will share how this framework and mobility data are being used for regional collaboration and internally within grant-making organizations. So panelists, I'm gonna get you up here and have you introduce yourself when you sit down. We're gonna skip that part that you were ready for, so get ready for it. You're gonna hear a little bit more from them in a second, and I'm gonna tell you all what we're gonna do in this panel, give you a little agenda preview. So during this session, we're going to take you on a data journey. We're going to start with a presentation on Urban Institute's Upward Mobility Framework, followed by a section on stakeholder perspective, and concluding with an overview on Richmond's Regional Indicators Initiative. After the presentations, we'll have about 30 minutes for dialogue. So please, as you're listening, write down all the questions and comments that come to mind as you hear each of these presentations. We encourage curiosity as well as sharing your own experiences to enhance this rich dialogue today. So let's get started in exploring how we can harness the power of data to drive meaningful change in our communities. With that, I'm going to take the mic over to folks and let them introduce themselves, their name and their title and pronouns, and then I'll hand it over to you, Alexis.
Hi folks, Isabel Eljaiek. I'm the Senior Officer of Data and Research at the Community Foundation. My pronouns are she, her.
Hi everybody, I'm Frank Cardella. I'm Director of Research and Evaluation at United Way of Greater Richmond and Petersburg. I use me and mine for pronouns, but you can use any ones you want.
Hello, Alexis Weaver, Policy Program Associate at the Urban Institute, and I use she, her pronouns.
So I should have done that before. Sareen Adhikari, I work as the Principal Data Manager here in PlanRVA, and I go by he or her. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks panelists. Alexis, I'll give it to you.
See how well I can juggle everything up here. Well, I am so thrilled to be here today. I am one of the technical assistance leads for the Urban Institute's Upward Mobility Initiative, and I'm going to present our Upward Mobility Framework as a foundation for understanding and organizing regional leaders and communities around the opportunity for sustained upward mobility from poverty. Communities across the country want to help residents achieve economic success, exit poverty, and live in a more equitable society. Many local leaders have committed to the hard work of dismantling barriers and building systems that support upward mobility and advance racial equity, but often lack the information they need to reach those goals and understand whether their efforts are working. The Urban Institute's Upward Mobility Initiative helps communities fill those gaps. Through our Upward Mobility Framework, we provide communities with a way to define and measure upward mobility. So I'm going to do a brief overview of the history and development of the framework to situate us in this conversation. The Upward Mobility Framework builds on a previous effort by the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, which was a convening of 24 leading voices representing academia, practitioners, the faith community, philanthropy, community stakeholders, and the private sectors. It includes such well-known figures such as Raj Chetty, Ajin Poo, and others who came together to understand and talk through the question of what would it take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty. As many of you all know, who have worked in anti-poverty sectors over many years and decades, it can be frustrating to know that you are doing the best job and putting the best effort forward and still not see sustained changes in opportunity for the community members that you work with and serve. The aim of the partnership was to gather research and evidence and coalesce around a shared answer to that question, and it resulted in some notable findings. The key of which is that economic success alone is not enough to sustain upward mobility from poverty. In order to move out of poverty and stay out of poverty, people also needed to feel that they have power and autonomy in their lives and that they are valued in their community. So the core piece of the Upward Mobility Framework is this three-part definition of mobility from poverty. That you have economic success, yes. A person has adequate income and assets to support their and their family's material well-being. But you are valued also in your community, feeling respect, dignity, and sense of belonging that comes from contributing to and being appreciated by the people that live in the community with you. And power and autonomy, when a person has the ability to have control over their life, to make choices and influence larger policies and actions that affect their future. So an example of this is that through research, if jobs came with more money, so you increase wages, but did not also come with more power or more choice, upward mobility was not sustainable. Similarly, programs that do neighborhood empowerment, but don't focus on how to bring more wealth to a community, won't be able to sustain that neighborhood empowerment. If we really want to increase mobility from poverty, we need to make progress on all three of these dimensions. For most people experiencing poverty in the US today, opportunities to achieve greater economic success, power and autonomy, and dignity are blocked by long-standing structural barriers, not by a failure of individual effort. Many of these barriers have resulted from and are perpetuated by racist beliefs, norms, policies, and practices that have produced deep and persistent inequities. We know that racism persists across multiple domains and sectors. For our conversation today, we're going to talk about housing, and this afternoon's panel will be very intentionally focused on conversations around housing. So the practice of redlining, denying mortgage loans to certain neighborhoods or areas deemed high risk based on race, ethnicity, and immigration status of the people living there, created stark racial disparities that persist to this day in home ownership, wealth building, and school funding. and ultimately someone's ability to achieve economic success. Barriers to homeownership can also impact someone's ability to feel that they have control over their life and make the choices they want to make. Homeownership barriers also make it difficult for people to feel valued in their neighborhoods and connected to their neighbors, especially if their inability to buy a home leads them to move more frequently. To understand how successful interventions have increased economic success, power and autonomy, and dignity and belonging, we selected 6 programs with rigorous evidence of economic impact and strong intentionality in improving power and autonomy and/or dignity and belonging to study. We call these the exemplars. In an extremely detailed report available on Urban's website, you can dive into all of the evidence behind each of these programs, highlighting the Nurse-Family Partnership, Educare, Youth Build, the City University of New York Accelerated Study in Associate Programs, Moving to Opportunity, and Family Rewards. All of these exemplars offered some form of material assistance to participants as a means of reducing stress and generating momentum on the path to economic success. And as I mentioned, they also had components of power and autonomy and dignity and belonging. Our research team visited these sites and conducted detailed assessments to understand how those three parts of the definition were working in those programs. They are great examples that address all parts of the 3-part definition of upward economic mobility in practice, but we know that programs alone, no matter how effective, are unlikely to fully break down the daunting social and systemic barriers that often prevent people from achieving mobility from poverty. We also know that getting to scale is a huge challenge for many programs. And so this is where the upward mobility framework can be helpful for communities in their work on economic mobility. I'm going to take a few minutes and walk you through the framework. This is the upward mobility framework. The reason we decided to move beyond simply the 3-part definition is we wanted to find ways to measure all 3 dimensions of poverty in a comprehensive but concise way that a policymaker could use to understand whether their community could support mobility from poverty. In order for communities to become launch pads for mobility, local change makers needed intermediate term measures of conditions that they could influence. We developed this framework with the support of a very smart group of academics and tested it in the field to see how well it worked for local change makers. We will continue, we see this as a living framework, so we continue to update and change as we learn more about what works and where there are opportunities to grow. So just wanted to break this down piece by piece, because it was a very small graphic. So the framework starts with the 3-part definition. I encourage folks, we don't have it up here, but I often, when I'm talking about the 3-part definition, start with power and autonomy or start with dignity and belonging and then bring economic success alongside it. The next part are these 5 essential pillars that communities need in order to support upward mobility of residents. They overlap. They are not meant to be silos, but organizing mechanisms that individuals and households, as we all know, experience the impacts of all of these pillars when they are working well or when they are not working well. So we see opportunity-rich and inclusive neighborhoods, high-quality education, rewarding work, healthy environment and access to good health care, and responsive and just governance. We're going to talk a little bit about each one of these, and I think y'all will be diving in deeper into the opportunity-rich and inclusive neighborhoods pillar, but they're all critical to understanding upward mobility from poverty. When it comes to opportunity-rich and inclusive neighborhoods, neighborhoods play a central role in supporting family stability and well-being, their access to social and economic opportunities, and their children's chances to thrive and succeed. High-quality education from preschool through post-secondary provides a crucial avenue to economic and social mobility. Rewarding work refers to jobs and wages that constitute the primary source of income and economic security for most people in the U.S. today. Healthy environment and access to good health care helps people of all ages surmount life's challenges, excel in school and on the job. ensure their family's well-being, and fully participate in their communities. Responsive and just governance, attentive to the needs of all community members and residents who are engaged in decision-making, are hallmarks of a community that supports upward mobility. And then underpinning and interwoven into every one of these pillars is to ensure equitable access for all, especially for people of color and other marginalized groups who have been most denied access to upward mobility. We often talk in our work on the upward mobility framework about the fact that equity is both an outcome and a process. And so we want to make sure that as folks are diving in deeper into the upward mobility framework, that they understand this foundational value as it relates to upward mobility. And then next we have the predictors. Under each of the pillars are predictors which are strongly correlated with the likelihood that a community can create conditions to boost the economic and social mobility of its residents while narrowing racial and ethnic inequities. These evidence-based factors are strongly associated with the likelihood, I just read that again, sorry. The predictors were chosen by a working group of academics after a rigorous and thorough review of academic research around factors that most strongly influence mobility. These 24 cover various aspects of community and all stages of the life cycle. These are the 24 that that the academics began and selected as the initial set for the framework, but they considered a much fuller suite of predictors as they were looking into, again, what are the factors that affected mobility from poverty. I believe there were over 65 at one time. One of the goals of the framework is to, again, give clear, concise information to communities and the public to help make this useful. And to that end, we have an evidence resource library that includes all 24 of the predictors, but also includes the additional ones as well. And so one of the nice things about our evidence resource library and these predictors is that there's a high-level summary of how it is connected to upward mobility. And then beyond that, there are very specific details, including citations, where the research shows, how those things are backed up with that evidence. And then there is a component that connects it explicitly to which part of the three-part definition it is also supports. And I'm gonna show you an example of that in just a minute. Then as we think about those predictors, we also wanna understand how we might be able to measure progress and understand what's happening in each of these pillars. There are many that can be used. Urban has assigned what we call a set of the mobility metrics. We intend for these to be a starting place, not a final destination. And so one example for access to preschool, there might be a metric, the mobility metric is what is the share of children enrolled in nursery school or preschool. And as we have pulled together these 26 metrics, we specifically looked at where the availability was, nationally available data. We wanted to make sure that for every county in the United States, and now also for every city or place that has more than 75,000 people, each of these 26 metrics is available to them. There is additionally on this website examples of the background in terms of how available it is it accessible and disaggregated by race, how frequently is it updated. All of them come from publicly available data sources. They can really be helpful in understanding conditions on the ground as they stand, but there may be limitations as well. But I'm going to use this as an example of how to connect the framework, the predictors, potential outcomes, the metrics, and the mobility dimensions. So what you have here on the left is the rewarding work pillar, followed by the predictors of employment opportunities, jobs, paying living wages, opportunities for income, financial security, wealth building opportunities, etc. One potential mobility outcome that a community might decide is that they want to see employers paying living wages and providing benefits that enable stability. If that was an outcome, the mobility metric that one might look to is what is the ratio of pay on an average job to the cost of living. that connects to economic success, but it also connects to dignity and belonging and power and autonomy, because it's providing people more than what they need for their basic needs. It also allows them to contribute to their family and contribute to their community. So one of the things that we recommend, and that I know Sarah in particular is going to talk about, is where's the opportunity to supplement these data, nationally available data, with local data sources. So again, we want this to be a starting point, but we understand that there may be better or different or more useful indicators of success and impact that are available, by data experts in the local community. I wanted to spend just a quick little bit on how we have taken the framework as it exists and have started to think about how we apply it in the community. We don't want this to be something that lives on a shelf. And so to that end, we are engaging in a suite of support tools to help, in particular, local communities understand and engage in their work on upward economic mobility. One of these tools, again, all of the things that I'm sharing are available on the website, on our Upward Mobility website, is our Upward Mobility Planning Guide. Essentially, this is a way to accompany the framework to assist municipalities and counties and their partners in boosting mobility from poverty in their communities, really oriented around where are the opportunities to build a cross-sector team, how to plan for, advocate for, and engage in systems change strategies, really meant and oriented towards people who had that question, where do I start? And it was informed by what we call the Boosting Upward Mobility Cohort. This was a set of 8 primarily counties and primarily county governments prior to the planning guide being released, that took the framework, went to these 8 communities and worked with them for 12 to 18 months, creating mobility action plans for their community. Again, largely informed the actions that were then folded into the planning guide, required a lot of intensive support. And so as we came out of looking at those mobility action plans, this is one example from Philadelphia, they tied their actions and their initiatives to the 3-part definition, and you can see the predictors that they used, and then they identified some key strategic actions, largely informed by, again, cross-sector stakeholder engagement that they were going to undertake as part of their mobility action planning process. So they focused on housing, financial well-being, neighborhoods, and work. And again, each of these plans for each of these 8 is available on our website. But it's not necessarily sustainable to offer that level of support to communities across the country, but we wanted to make sure that the framework is accessible to leaders across the country. And so the next phase of our application is the Mobility Action Learning Network. That is one of the things that I am a lead for. 26 teams across the United States were selected to participate in this network goal, with the idea that we would equip with data, promising practices, opportunities to learn from each other to address local challenges related to upward mobility. We hope that network members will leave this network initiative with an increased capacity and understanding of how to apply the upward mobility framework, tools, and resources. We have 4 tracks. So rather than doing a full comprehensive mobility action plan, we very intentionally selected communities who are already demonstrating work around upward mobility and asked them to identify which area would be most beneficial to accelerate those efforts. So we have a using data for decision-making track, building coalitions for systems change, empowering community partners, and measuring impact. And the measuring impact track, which I would say had a higher standard of selection, is the one that I'm so pleased to have Richmond, the team from Richmond, a part of. This is, while it is 26, it is still a highly selective group of communities. I think there were over 50 something communities that applied. And in looking at Richmond's application, we really saw the high readiness to participate in having these conversations and doing this work They had, there was you all had a clear identified economic mobility challenge, multi-policy agendas as a way to approach it, demonstrated capacity to sustain the work. So having partners like Community Foundation at the table, and then a strong established ongoing partnership between both government and non-governmental partners. And so it's very exciting to have Richmond be a part of this team. And I think Frank and Isabel are going to talk a little bit more about what that means for you all in the community. I am assuming that this is going to get shared back in some way, so there are links to all the resources that I talked about in the deck that hopefully will go out. But I really encourage you all to check out our website, which is, and I'm sorry it's not on the screen, it's upward-mobility.urban.org. And there's a lot of great resources and interactive materials on that. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over.
So in the spirit of collaboration, we're going to do this together, if you don't mind. Let's see where we are. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about data and philanthropy and partially how we all got here in the first place. Alexis talked about the application and what being one of 26 regional teams that applied and was selected, but how did we get to that point? This was a referenced as a very high readiness group, so we were already doing something. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get into what the data means to us in the philanthropic sector. So in early 2022, we had initial conversations already going on. There were multiple data projects being done, I don't want to say siloed, but simultaneously among Community Foundation, United Way, PlanRVA. We were all working on these data indicators. And the leadership started meeting and saying, well, we're all doing this already, why don't we do it together? And so as we started to have these conversations, it became apparent that the more that we collaborated, the more we could improve the systems, the more we could take collective action up to the next step and really share out this data in a way that was going to be useful beyond our three orgs. And that, I think, became a significant drumbeat that we were marching to at that point. It's not just for us, it's for everybody. This is going to be communal data. So we set out to design this comprehensive and collective data framework, and Saren's going to lean into that towards the end. But we had gotten very familiar with the work that Chetty's Opportunity Atlas had provided for everyone, and obviously the research coming from Urban Institute, along with the beta cohort, those 8 counties that Alexis mentioned, engaging with the Upward Mobility Framework already. So Urban had just opened up an application for this new opportunity, a different kind of technical assistance than the previous cohort, and so we applied and were awarded as one of those 26 cities and counties. And that brings us to the next phase of our collaboration. Other cities that were already mentioned, I'll just point out, we really look towards the opportunity to engage with some of those cities because they face similar challenges, or they have similar demographics, or they have similar structures in place. And what's really neat, and I think everybody who works with data understands this at a core level, the more you look into the differences between localities, the more you see the similarities. So whether it's Richmond or Denver, whether it's Rochester or Fairfax, there are some underlying issues that we all share together. And so the solutions really can take on, they can kind of morph into these collaborative efforts. So we are going to receive training individually and together. We're going to be able to learn from and with each other in this process to implement these strategies, really aimed at increasing upward mobility and increasing racial equity.
I won't go into the different tracks like we had planned because I think Alexis did a really good job of explaining the 4 different ones. So I want to give a little bit of insight into what the focus of our implementation team is doing. So we started out with a group of 3 organizations, the United Way, PlanRVA, and the Community Foundation. When we were accepted into the Mobility Action Learning Network, we broadened our team to include representation from the Partnership for Housing Affordability and from Chamber RVA. The Partnership for Housing Affordability was chosen for inclusion in this team because they've already laid a very strong groundwork of policy and systems recommendations to affect change on the affordable housing level in our region. And Chamber RVA was chosen because the rewarding work pillar is going to be the next pillar developed as part of the regional plan work that many stakeholders in this room are involved in. So once we expanded our team, we have also started to put together a working group of experts in both affordable housing, data, and practitioners that are working in the field who are going to be helping us and check checkpoints along the way with what we're producing. So what is it that we're producing? Alexis talked about mobility action plans that the initial 8 counties developed, and those covered all of the pillars and a very broad approach to the work. Our team has chosen to go deep on one pillar, which is the opportunity-rich and inclusive neighborhoods pillar. So all of our work is focused on the predictors that are underneath that housing pillar. As an output of our work, we're going to come up with this mobility action plan. We're first tackling an analysis of our current mobility conditions in relation to this pillar. Like Alexis mentioned, the metrics can be chosen at a local level, and that was a really attractive feature of this framework for us, is that we do have a lot of data competencies and we do have a lot of data strengths that are already existing in our community. United Way has the indicators of strength where they've been tracking educational outcomes. The Community Foundation have been working with PlanRVA already to develop an affordable housing dashboard to inform our grant making. So we're reviewing the current conditions related to this pillar, and we're also doing a deep dive into that evidence research library that Alexis mentioned, because there are more than those 24 predictors, and some of those predictors might be a better fit to explain our current mobility conditions here in Richmond and in the region. Once we're done sussing out the metrics, we're going to be creating a systems change-oriented logic model that's going to define the strategic actions that some of which the Partnership for Housing Affordability has elegantly articulated, but we'll also be weaving in some direct service components into that will directly address how we can affect change within that pillar in the region. And then the final part of our product, which will include a lot of community engagement and practitioner engagement, is to create a measurement plan to make sure we're tracking along that logic model in the long term. This is a long-term marathon strategy. These aren't outcomes or outputs that we expect to realize in the 2 to 3 year period. We're talking 5 to 10 years. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit from the framework because we also want to talk a little bit about data within our respective organizations and how we're using data for decision-making and philanthropy. So we've talked about this regional level data indicator set, and Saren will go into a lot more detail on that, but that's one set of data that we use to inform our decision-making. We also use data at the program level to help understand the actual conditions in the community and the programs that are affecting change. So this diagram illustrates a cyclical process for funders who use data to inform our grant strategies and for measuring impact. Data is used at every stage of this cycle, from identifying community needs to evaluating the impact of programs and advocacy and research efforts. This cycle emphasizes continuous improvement, using data from evaluation and learning activities to reevaluate community needs and program delivery, which then reinform our grant-making decisions. It is surely an iterative process, and it ensures that the interventions will remain relevant and effective in addressing the evolving needs of our community. And as we've covered, the framework highlights the importance of collaboration between and among various partners. An example here is that the Community Foundation, as we're refining our grant-making strategies to fit within the economic mobility framework, will be including co-creating evaluation protocols with nonprofits who are implementing programs and advocacy efforts that support economic mobility. So by using data throughout this grant-making process, we as funders can make more informed decisions about where to allocate our resources, and nonprofits can demonstrate their effectiveness and iterate for enhanced service delivery. So at the Community Foundation, we use strategic frameworks with defined measures to ensure we have alignment for enhanced impact. And over the course of the past several years, our foundation has a focused data strategy, which requires grant applicants to report disaggregated demographic data about who holds power within an organization, specifically collecting information on the CEO, the board members, and the senior team as defined by a nonprofit. This predates our understanding of power and autonomy of the framework, but it fits really elegantly, and it's some of the pre-work that we've done that is a really great fit with this framework. This demographic data is important to our funding decisions, as research from Echoing Green and Bridgespan has shown that there are funding disparities for nonprofits led by people of color. The research has revealed that revenues of Black-led orgs are about 24% smaller than revenues of their white-led counterparts, and that unrestricted net assets of Black-led organizations are 76% smaller than their white-led counterparts. So by collecting and analyzing these data, we aim to gain a clear understanding of the diversity of leadership within the sector. And this transparency as well helps us to identify and address disparities in leadership representation and make sure we're allocating resources with an equitable focus.
So as Isabel stated, data is used at every stage of the cycle, right? Whether it's internal or external, local, state, national, whether it's provider data or client feedback. There might be different levels of granularity, but it's all with the same goal of sussing out the root causes of problems and finding ways of most effectively and efficiently targeting dollars to solve those problems. So one of the things that we've done over the years at United Way is to provide a lot of data support to a number of the organizations that may not have the capacity, they may not have staffing size to run their own data analysis. We provided the indicators of community strength as a way of curating and doing the analysis on large data sets to really create that value add in addition to the funding that we provide to organizations. And so when you think about the capacity of a small nonprofit to be able to have that work done ahead of time, it allows them to free up staff, it allows them to free up resources to really try and move the needle rather than having to worry about where the data sets are and are they trustworthy and all of that. So as we work towards that, it also allows us to, by kind of fronting the data to folks, it allows us to have conversations with the partners that we work with in the community around their goals, right? So we can meet with a lot of our funded partners individually and talk about things that allow us to look at big picture. So for example, right outside this building, within 3-block radius, right, of this building, there are at least 6 nonprofits that are all working with probably the same population of people. If we just look at the data that we collect from them and we get the number of clients served, we're gonna have a lot of overlap in that. But by working with those individual organizations to say, have you had the chance to talk to this organization, or have you considered working in partnership with this organization? You're serving the same population. How can we multiply the effect of those limited dollars that are available? So that opportunity really helps us to work with partners to move the needle. The other thing that really creates is shared responsibility. And this is for me, this is a really big one, that when we get into conversations about data, a lot of times we collect data from folks, but then we share it back to an audience like this. But it's also important that we share it back to the folks that we've collected it from. And having that shared responsibility for the data from point to point, talking about how we all use it and what it's really, what's the purpose of it, is critical in attracting community champions. It's not just about what can you do with the data, what can you do with the funding, it's how can you tell your story and who else will tell your story? And how can we bring all those people in the room together? So the opportunity to convene not just the providers, but champions and match them up together has been a great asset of the data work. Community Foundation and United Way, we fund many of the same programs and nonprofit organizations together, and that in itself is another data point. And that data point is credibility. So when you can take these organizations and you see who's at the table discussing these issues, that is often as important as the rest. It underscores the need, right? So it's as important as the dollars is who you bring into the room. And so we're always happy to be working together, addressing these similar kinds of issues. But there are some folks that are not captured in all of the data. And earlier, Alexis talked about the upward mobility framework, and we're going to talk about that again, but how it's designed to provide guidance to coalitions working to help move people out of poverty, move them from poverty to prosperity. And much of the data that's used by organizations like United Way, like Community Foundation, many of our partners, this is centered around people who are currently living in poverty. We are trying to help them find a way up. But there's another group of people, and it's actually a much larger group. These are often not captured in the data sets, right? The United Way refers to these people as ALEC. It's an acronym that stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. These are folks who are working as hard as they can, many times more than one job, but they still can't make ends meet. And in Virginia, when we look at the number of people that are living in a situation defined as poverty by the federal poverty guidelines, that's about 11% of the state. But there's almost 3 times as many people who are living just one incident away from falling into that same situation. They are living paycheck to paycheck, and we really do our best. The United for Alice movement has data collection teams in 28 states now, plus the District of Columbia, to really track local wage and expense data. You're looking at the power of local economies to impact lives. And that helps to ensure that we're supporting people to make sure they don't fall down into poverty. So while on the one hand, we are definitely very excited to have the upward mobility framework to be lifting people out of poverty, but at the same, with the other hand, we're also trying to keep people from falling down in the first place. So this data often gets, unfortunately, overlooked when you're developing means-tested programs or other kinds of supplemental poverty reduction measures. And it's because it's based on these local economies that it has so much difficulty. It's a moving target. It's based on the cost of living where you are, as opposed to the federal definition of poverty. So that's another aspect that we are definitely paying attention to and trying to collaborate to bring folks to wrap around, arms around people to keep them out of the poverty pipeline in the first place. And I think it's back.
Thank you, Frank, Isabel, and Alexis. In line of the presentations that have happened so far, I'd like to highlight briefly, and not taking too much of the panel's time, the efforts that we have been undertaking here at PlanRVA to develop a regional indicators data system or a regional indicators dashboard, by which we intended to solve some of the existing issues with data diversity, if there is a term like that, so that we are all looking at that one indicator instead all of us looking at different indicators and making different assumptions about the state of housing or economy, transportation access, etc. in the region. So partners like Community Foundation, United Way, Chambers, and some of them are listed on this slide, but many more, they have come together with the clear intention that we need to have a tracking system in Richmond, community tracking system, sort of track everything system, not in a creepy way. Basically, try and understand where our dollars are going, and if they are going in some programs, are we moving the needle? So the needle part is what we need to track. Because as Isabel mentioned earlier, there are lots of programs in the pipeline and programmatic expenditures happening. But then, are we measuring the right outcome? Outcome is what we want to start measuring. Because no matter what programs we invest ourselves into, unless the outcomes change, nothing changes. We talk about, if we focus on the housing, we talk about inclusive zone, we talk about, which are all good, accessory dwelling units, preserving mostly on the rental side. We talk about affordability requirements, but how can we measure if that has actually improved affordability to those who really could not afford in the past, or to tell us how are those programs making any difference to those groups? And that's where we came together with a plan. Let's do a regional indicators project. Wow, great plan. And what do? We don't know. So we started looking, what do we have in terms of indicator tracking system that we can possibly learn from and establish, create a indicators tracking system that can be the single one, the one God for Richmond. We looked into our very old initiative, the Capital Region Collaborative RVA snapshot, which many of you over here are familiar with. We also looked at our extra-regional partners at Greater Washington Partnership, regional growth dashboard. We were very excited to have Raj Shetty from Richmond and stir up this conversation once more so that everybody was starting to talk about how this is great. And we also looked at those indicators. Unfortunately, the indicators were not being revised, so we are stuck at 2015. And then we finally ended up stumbling upon Urban Institute's affordability framework, which aligned very nicely with whatever this region was talking about even before meeting them. And after we started engaged with Urban Institute and this learning network, we became more confident that whatever this framework is, it is what we wanted to develop in the first place in Richmond. And it helps us do half the job, basically, in identifying what to track. Because that would be a big discussion, maybe a fight, if Urban Institute was not there. They hadn't already done this job. What to track is a big question. Now we have a place where we can start from. So the upward mobility framework, of course, touches upon a lot of different holistic, comprehensive way that we can track our communities. We, right now, are focused on our 5 specific key categories. We used to call them pillars. Nowadays, we deliberately avoid using the word pillar, because when you say pillar, it feels like they are disjointed, disconnected, and they are just one silo at a time. Whereas these indicators are not, they are not in a vacuum. Any individual can be simultaneously connected to all these issues at the same time. Any families who do not have wealth, do not have a good paying job, can't send their kids to childcare, affordable childcare, and there are no way, and are in debt, and are in persistent debt, cannot get out of the poverty. The only way probably they can do that with education, building up their skills, and getting a good job, getting transportation to that good job, not missing the job on the first day and getting fired, or second, third, any day and getting fired. Being able to send the child to a childcare so that the parents can work, as opposed to someone who is staying home just because they cannot find a childcare, affordable childcare nearby. And being able to afford a house, which seems like a dream in Richmond right now. So being able to build that equity, that savings to at least make a down payment, get some support, and then finally be able to afford a house and start building wealth rather than paying rent. In Manchester, which recently changed from a very medium income up to slightly unattainable. So rather than doing that, start building wealth. And probably at some point, maybe the next generation gets an even better education. They get to choose neighborhoods where they want to live, where the amenities are good, where the infrastructure is good, schools are good. And probably the next generation gets better education, better opportunities, goes up in that social mobility ladder. So we see all these key categories as interconnected, and we want to keep it that way. All the data that we track, we are trying to make sure that they represent that all of them are interconnected. One impacts the other, and the first one gets impacted by the second. So we embarked upon, based on the knowledge we learned from Urban Institute, and based on all the experts and real people with boots on the ground in the field, experiences from them, our partners in the region, we started building indicators, a list of indicators that we can and we want to track. There is a big difference between what we want to track and what we can track. Because sometimes what we want to track, we cannot, because there is no data for that. And what we can track is sometimes not what we want to track. So we have to find that middle line. And we work with our partners to keep asking them, what would make more sense for you all to track in terms of where your programs are funding, where your grants meeting is happening in the fields of housing, affordable transportation, affordable education, child, and so on. So what makes more sense for you to track about? And they helped us identify those indicators. And we, as a data provider in the region, as a wannabe data warehouse in the region, let me do some marketing for we would go back to our drafting board, so we'd try and find the best measurable indicator that is easier to get, that is mostly publicly available, that has a chance that it's gonna be there next year, and year after that, and year after that, so that we can keep tracking. So we would make sure that we do all the homework for them to understand what indicator is probably the best to track, what others are tracking, what is Greater Washington Partnership tracking, what is in the books of Urban Institute and all the other agencies, all the PDCs in the region. And we basically sourced all and picked a few with help of these awesome folks who helped us to work this model. And then we started developing the data pipelines, pulling data from all the sources on a recurring, automated way, developing indicators from them, tracking, okay, what is the total, how do we normalize that? So all the statistics stuff that nobody wants to listen to, but which takes a lot of time. And then finally, the visualizations, which everyone wants to look at, but doesn't want to know what goes behind. So we started building this pipeline of pulling data, doing the math, and then making the visualizations. And we started working on our dashboard elements. So our dashboards, which are currently in development, they work on 3 different geographies. We make sure that we are tracking data for everybody in the region. We make sure that we are tracking the same data for localities so that we can compare, so you can pit one against other. And then we also go down at the census tract level to understand what is happening in special pockets in the region. How are they different from the regional trends? Who is lagging behind? So that is important, especially from the grants making perspective. Where do you want to focus? Which population you want to focus? And as far as possible, we have tried to disaggregate all of our data using race, ethnicity, if possible, age brackets, and many times income brackets and housing typologies. Any issues for a single mom with 2 kids is going to be different from a regular family with a 2-parent, 2 kids and something. So we want to highlight those 5 housing typologies that HUD has created, and we are also putting those typologies in the data, creating the interceptions. When we create the final intersections and we start making our visualizations to make sure that we display the data, providing all the filters available. You want to filter by which year you want to look at the data. It should be there. Filter by race, it should be there. Filter by race and age, it should be there. Filter by, if available, race and family type, it should be there. So we're trying to create all those intersections and track information either in a bar graph format where there is a regional trend, and you can compare if you are above or below the trend, and or a map format where you can just navigate around, click on a map, census tract, and see how it is doing in terms of data. So we have been working on demographics dashboard to understand the basic demographics of the region, housing indicators, including all of the indicators displayed before, most of the indicators displayed before. Educational indicators, understanding the educational attainment and K through 12 outcome in the region by locality, by district, by tract, and transportation indicators. We are yet to develop our economy and health indicators, but we will get there. So basically, I wanted to use these 10 minutes. I tend to go beyond my time limit normally, but sorry about that. I will to just show you what we are doing, our efforts and our intentions, most efforts and intentions. We want to go far. We're not there yet, but we will get there. So I'll hand it back to our moderator and let the discussion begin. Thank you.
All right, with that, I'll ask our panelists to come back up to the chairs. They're gonna grab their mics and we're gonna get some questions and conversation going, so come join us. All right, so while Saren joins the panel, I'll ask a couple of questions, but as I ask those questions, I want you all to be thinking about the dialogue that you'd like to have with the panelists. They shared a lot of really good information, and hopefully they sparked some really good thoughts or input that you have to this initiative, whether it's a data set that you have that hasn't been considered, or a community feedback piece that should be included in this, or a question around a graph or a map. Or anything that came to mind. This is intended to be a dialogue for the next half hour. So I'll kick us off and then I'm gonna unclip the mic and walk around and get the dialogue started. So to get us started, Alexis, in your part, we talked about opportunity-rich and inclusive neighborhoods. And you discussed the critical role of that as you illustrated the pillars. That's also the pillar that the Richmond region is starting with as they implement this Urban Institute framework. Could you talk a little bit about how does Urban Institute define a neighborhood? And I'm talking about the geographic space of a neighborhood. This is a really squishy definition that we use when we talk about community, or how have other communities defined it? And then Frank, Saren, or Isabel, I'm gonna ask you to talk about how in the Richmond region are you defining neighborhoods as you look at this pillar?
So I don't have the formal definition in front of me. I do observe that there does tend to be a shorthand to say, oh, this is the housing pillar. But I actually think that it's really, really important that we didn't call it the housing pillar. We called it opportunity-rich and inclusive neighborhoods. And even when you look at the predictors, right, there are predictors, whether they, to Saren's point of, the intention is not to have these be silos. There are elements of access to healthcare that can be predictors for an opportunity-rich and inclusive neighborhood, right? There are things that are not on there, for example, around built environment, that also connect to both opportunity-rich and inclusive neighborhoods, as well as healthcare, as well as just and responsive policing, like and governance, and some of the policing predictors can go under that. So, I actually think that neighborhoods was intended to not be a technical academic definition, but instead to be a way to represent what we all know, that even though a lot of times we start and data starts at the individualistic level, that we are not islands into and of ourselves. And we really don't have great framing for what it means to be household units, family units. Everything that we talk about is loaded and charged in some way. And I think neighborhoods gets to the spirit of trying to help us visualize and imagine what a thriving community that everybody who is a part of that is able to access, enjoy, replicate, offer space to others as a part of it. So that's not very data oriented, but
I'll take the technical part. Neighborhood's a squishy subject. It's not an absolute term, and we're here in what most people would consider Manchester, but a lot of historic residents consider it Swansboro or parts of it Blackwell. So it's not an absolute you can find in the data, and that's why it's been really important to our data project to take data down to the census level track. There are limitations to census level data with the validity of some of it, but census level is, I think, as close as we can get to describing and how people would understand a neighborhood through the data.
Yeah, and I'll agree with that and add just the extra wrinkle of letting people define for themselves what their neighborhood is. If you, for example, walk out of the playground at Crestwood Elementary School, which is a Chesterfield school, you can walk through that lawn into Huguenot High School or Thompson Middle School, and those are Richmond schools. So for the residents that live literally across a geopolitical boundary, they may feel like they're part of the same neighborhood, even though we have to deal with different organizations to get the work done.
Right, here we go. Raise those hands. Who has a question? Oh, this is great. All right, I'm gonna start in the front, work my way to the back. Here we go, Jessica.
So this is kind of about the data sources.
You're in the right place.
So I just read a book, Invisible Women, Data Bias in the World Designed for Men. I noticed that gender was not brought up in any of these points and how that affects the things that get implemented in our country. And how is that being played out in all of this data that you're collecting?
We segment by gender. We're segmenting by
Okay.
gender in the data collection that we're doing at the regional level.
Okay, I didn't see it anywhere on any of those data points, so that's why I was.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it should have been intentional, but normally when we collect data where we know gender is gonna be an issue, for example, when I mentioned a single mom with 2 kids, that is a very intentionally collected data.
Yeah.
So depending on the issues, the topics, and we try to intentionally pick data points that are specific to a certain gender. Otherwise, for example, if we are just talking about transit accessibility, doesn't matter which gender you are not having enough accessibility in your neighborhood, right? But if there are areas where, and it's a crowdsourced project. I mean, if there are areas, hey, you really should be collecting gender data on that one, yeah, we would be open to that, doing that.
That specific thing that you just mentioned about accessibility, women are less likely to go somewhere by themselves in a transit area that is secluded or off the side of the main path than men are. And so those are things that affect those that aren't thought about when they're taking those into consideration. So that's where I'm coming
Yeah,
from.
thank you for raising that, that's really important.
And just to add on to this from the predictor side and the evidence resource library, which I didn't necessarily have time to go into, there are some pieces around gender, there's a lot more around race, but the research itself does try to highlight, to Saren's point, where gender does have an evidence and sort of very clear disparities as it relates again to upward mobility, that does try to get articulated
whether we have, again, sort of to Sarah's point as well, we don't always have the metrics that kind of get there, but that is in some of the underlying sort of assumptions as well.
Yeah, and I think there's a case to be made for indicator-specific values there too as well. So whether it's transportation or particularly healthcare, right? Maternal health of Black and brown women is significantly worse, right, than for white counterparts. So there are cases where having the ability to layer race and gender and all of that together.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you. So it's, speaking of layering data, I was so excited to see the mapping work that PlanRVA is starting. I'm wondering, I think combining really the upward mobility framework and the mapping, to what extent there's thought to taking the mapping that you're doing of individual indicators and layering details on top of one another. As an example, I think that mapping could show that you have areas of opportunity in terms of good schools, access to good parks, employment, right? But you might not have attainable housing opportunities there. So to layer those different indicators can help you really start to shine a light on where the need for targeted resources might exist. I know that some communities are starting to do that, so I'm just curious, where your thinking is on that kind of.
No, I'm slowly smiling because that's what we want to do. That's what we're gonna, the idea of collecting data on different key areas or issue areas or pillars and pulling them together is to understand how are we doing collectively. As you said, that's a very great example. There is good school, there are good job accessibility, but there is no housing. So which means the neighborhood is not accessible to a certain percentage of the population. And we've been doing this in PlanRVA. We've created a series of maps and trying to understanding if you earn this salary, where in Richmond can you live? And we have a map showing that. So that is intentional. That is what the dashboard is intended to do. Thank you for lifting that up.
Go ahead, pass it on, this is great.
I know PlanRVA is doing a lot of work around climate resiliency as well, so I'm wondering if some of the data points that are being collected for the census tracts in the neighborhood is tied to things like access to healthy food and to heat islands, tree cover, and things like that.
Answer is yes. We have teams who are working on heat islands. There is a push towards identifying food deserts, but we have not really gotten to that point yet. Because trying to flag something, some area as a food desert needs to be really meticulously done, and you don't really want to put the cat out of the bag before it's ready to go, right? So we are not there yet, but that is in the pipeline. We want to understand where it is affordable for a certain income family, certain type of family to live in Richmond. We want to highlight that fact. We want to highlight the fact where the food deserts are. We want to highlight the fact, as you saw in one of the dashboard examples earlier, what is your transportation? What is the transit cost burden? How much does it cost you, depending on where you live and how much you make to go to your job or go commute to different parts of the city? So those layers will be, once they overlay, that'll give a better picture of where, and it's also not that we don't know. In a way, we know where in the region there are problems, but we want to show other peoples that this is what we think it is, right? Because every one of us probably knows where the problems in the region, but we need to have a common language to talk with it. And that's what it intends to be.
I'll also, separate from the regional framework, we're using data to target our investments around food access. So we partner with Feed more as a systems anchor, so they can use data to help us understand where we should be making investments. And then we've got a particular emphasis on fresh food access at the Community Foundation. So we've worked with our partners to bolster their data ability to report on common outputs so we can measure impact in meaningful ways in the communities that lack access.
And one of the things that I love about working collaboratively in these teams is that we can take issues like that and raise them across platforms. And so you bring up heat islands, for example. Well, we may be funding a lot of work with homeless shelters, the homeless population experiences greater mortality in hot months than they do in winter, which most people don't realize. And so having the ability to track all of that cross-collaboratively really has an impact on those lives.
Hi, specifically for your economic success indicator, was one of your sources, did you access the Virginia LMI, the labor market information, or any of that data, or any of the economists involved in that program?
We have yet to make our economics dashboard, but the BLS is our go-to source, and we compare BLS data with the LMI data because many times BLS's margins of error could be really high.
Hey, Sarah, what's BLS?
Sorry, it's a Bureau of Labor and Statistics that produces the economic data and the labor force data. Thank you.
So we're roughly 4 years on from the onset of COVID, and I think we all feel like things have changed, but what is the data telling us has changed? And I guess it could be anecdotal, but I'm just curious from a data perspective as well. How are we different as a society? You know, I don't feel like there's that sense of community perhaps as much as it was pre-COVID.
All right, I'll jump. Everybody loves a crisis, right? So we all pull together, everybody's all on the same team when something is going wrong. And as soon as we start to stabilize and find that new normal, people run back to what they're comfortable with. So in asking how are we different, there are, well, I think we all know, how many people have been on a Zoom today? Come on. All right, you're lucky people out there. But certain structural things have changed, but a lot of things are entrenched deeper than ever. And if you were struggling before COVID, you're certainly struggling worse now. And so many of those people, though, did experience a moment during COVID where their lives actually got a little better. And so that makes it all the more difficult to explain to them why all of a sudden they're no longer important. They're no longer able, we can't help you the way we did 2 years ago. One of the really difficult things when you talk about funding is that all the data lags by 2 years. So when we look at housing indicators, for example, and cost burden, right now, people are still, the data coming in shows that there were rent caps and housing subsidies. So people don't look as cost burdened, but we know that 2 years on, rents have skyrocketed. They're not the rents they were pre-COVID or even during COVID. So being able to reach those people and help them and target appropriate measures to them is even more difficult because some of the funding you're trying to draw down from let's say federal and state sources doesn't exist because the data lags by 2 years.
So, I think this is connected. One of the things that we have been talking about, particularly in this measuring impact track of the Mobility Action Learning Network, is what does it take to change systems? So often when we are doing the work, and before I was in urban, I worked at a food bank for like 10 years, so I get like service provision. But so often we get so focused on making those changes, which are critical and important, but we can get overwhelmed with that, right? Because it's that throwing that one rock in the water. And so part of our goal with the Upward Mobility Framework and with this work is to help get solidified processes and practices and understandings in place that are evidence-based. Because, you know, what we do know, whether we have updated data or not, is that for people who were struggling pre-pandemic, things are worse generally as a whole. And so the things that work, regardless of it, whether it's 38% or 45% in whatever metric, it's still hard. And so part of the work that we are trying to do is say, what does it take for communities to collaborate together for systems change, understand their impact together about all of these different individual organizations that are doing good work, but starting to get those gears not just turning on their own, but all turning together to make the system change. And so, I just think that that's a really important thing to hold up. I started my career in 2008, so at a Chamber of Commerce, and so I got to talk a lot about how bad the numbers were and how lagging they were. And so I think, that's going to continue to happen, but the trends, the things that we know, the evidence, we have lots of evidence outside of individual, outcome measures, individual program measures. We have lots of evidence that says things are hard for, many different populations, and there are things that work, but we have to work together to make them work.
And I'm gonna give an answer that I don't mean to be provocative, and it's simple. I think we learned from the data that directly resourcing people lifts people out of poverty. There's not more than that at this point, but we see that from the data, and I think that that's an important takeaway as we continue the journey.
Hi, one of the indicators for the housing indicators on your slide, Saren, was displacement pressure. Can you talk a little bit about what data is included in that?
I should have been more prepared. Yeah, displacement pressure. A little bit of background. We probably are aware that there was a study called market value analysis. The first market value analysis for the Richmond region was done in 2017, and the second market value analysis was done in 2022. So what that analysis tracks is primarily how is your housing market value is changing over time and where it is changing. But at the same time, there are other factors that go into classifying different markets as a good market, bad market. There are 7-8 categories of markets. But to do that classification, it uses factors like what is the foreclosure rates in the region? How about bank sales? How distressed? There are some distress indicators that it tracks. Is it occupied? Has it been unoccupied, vacant unit for a long time? They track the postal service information. And they kind of put together everything to understand how housing market for single family, for multifamily, and both categories are doing in Richmond. One of the variables that study also tracks is called displacement pressure. Now, think of it this way. A middle income family living in a transient neighborhood who is now not able to afford their house because a couple of reasons, probably either from a homeowner perspective or renter's perspective. First, I'll talk from the homeowner's perspective. So your surrounding neighborhood is growing really fast. New homeowners are coming in, houses are selling and way higher than what they supposed to sell in the past. And suddenly you see your real estate tax bill go really high. If you are part of a HOA, maybe the HOA rules will start to creep on you. If you have not been able to upkeep your property, maybe you'll get hit by some code violations here and there, and you will start paying fines. Eventually, all these factors together push that individual who cannot make as much as newcomers are making, and they have to. It's a natural process for them to move out, sell and move out. That is, in a way, it's the homeowner displacement pressure. On the rental side, it is much simpler. You rent an apartment, the landlord decides to raise the rent, just because everyone is raising the rent, just because the buildings are selling for very big money. They decide to raise the rent. You were already cost burdened. You were already spending 30, 35, 40% on your rent, and suddenly next month you cannot just get another job to pay that rent. And you decide to move to a cheaper neighborhood. It's a more simpler process. Regardless, you're being displaced. Now, the displacement pressure looks at how incomes have changed over time for people who live there. incomes are indexed to inflation factor. And then the cost of housing, how it has changed over time. So the ratio of cost of housing to income indexed to the inflation factor is called the displacement index, displacement pressure. It's an index, it's a unitless term. So does that make any sense?
Thank you.
Hi, this is really, I guess, I'll direct it to all of you. Just as a regular citizen living actually in Manchester, one of the things when we go to the community meeting is developers bring in requests for development that are special use permits. So in real time, we have to consider development pressures. So even knowing that there's a lag in data, I'd like to, if there is an index out there that talks about like access to green space and parks, because here in Manchester, there are no parks, right? I mean, we have the James River Park system, that's great, but only if you can hike, right? The nearest park is Alice Fitz, which you have to cross 2 major streets to get to, right? So a metric that would show how accessible parks are. And let me just put a plug in for other sort of social amenities, because I do realize that when you're in a really difficult place, maybe getting to a library is not the thing that's at the top of your list if you can't pay the rent. But it's really sad to me that like the Richmond Public Library is often not open on Sundays or doesn't open until 10, right? And the minute you go out to Henrico, oh, the library's open earlier and it's open 7 days a week. So, well, the one in Libby Mill is, okay? Some of them are, okay? So I would just like to see some sort of way of measuring sort of these more positive when we talk about a healthy neighborhood. To me, that is part of as a healthy neighborhood. It's not just the sort of really sad indicators or bad news indicators. So if those exist, great, just put them out there, we'll track them. And then we can make this, the reason why for me that connects to development is that when the special use permit comes in and we approve much more development of housing, there's nothing to say, hey, before that goes ahead, let's talk about these other things in our neighborhood that we don't have.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and we are trying to fund the update of the MVA, which would let us understand the displacement pressure as is now, even more updated than 2022. But your arguments are completely valid, and we might not have collected all the data yet, but we will note your comments.
Can I just add to that? One thing to add, I'm here on behalf of the Upward Mobility Initiative, but one of the nice things about participating in a project with Urban is that we have a whole suite of experts at the Urban Institute that we also are regularly, as part of this particular initiative, trying to connect communities with more directly and help bridge sort of conceptually if the framework doesn't have it yet, but we have this other research. The climate question is another one that kind of falls into. And so we are looking, I would say we are looking intentionally at that question about built environment in the framework. There are predictors at the moment. They don't have the right measures yet, but things like social capital is a predictor. Under healthy environment, there's one about air quality, for example. So we chose those metrics as, again, national level data that is accessible to everybody as a longer term indicator of progress or not. But I just wanted to lift that up as well, also for the team, that there are some folks who are having some conversations around that in the context of broadly upward mobility that I think we could bring in.
And thank you for lifting that up. We were just talking about social capital indicator at lunch, and maybe library usage or park usage could be something.
So to solve all these problems, we have lots and lots of service providers from government level, private foundations, nonprofits, all that type of thing. Are we collecting data on how much is being spent in a particular area and the outcomes from that? And is it well utilized? And I say this because I recently had an experience of listening to DSS talk about their challenges. And it was a mind blow in that over 40 years ago, I looked at the social work world, and 40 years later, they were still complaining about the exact same things. Not enough funding, not enough staff, oversubscribed demand. And I just sat there and went, nothing has changed. So are we measuring that, or are we just spending money, but nobody's really assessing what we're doing that way?
There is regional collaboration at the funder level, and I think that that's one of the real strengths of the regional plan and the framework coming together, is that within each of these pillar areas, there's going to be coalitions that are being built with funders, practitioners, systems folks, policymakers to specifically address that. I also think I want to add, this is why the systems component of the framework is really important, because we are still funding the same things we funded 40 years ago, and we're not going to direct service output our way out of the problems we're trying to tackle.
Exactly. Okay, great. Somebody else?
As you were talking about like the data sources, what kind of comes to mind is, I noticed that you had mentioned that the census is a big source of your data. Are you also like going into communities and talking to those leaders to kind of get to know that particular community? The reason why I say that is I participated in the Bicentennial Census and actually went door to door to folks' houses. There is a population of Hispanics that would not answer that census question because they were nervous about whether or not it was another government entity that would come and investigate them. So there also, in that data, could be missed information because we're not gathering it from these individuals that necessarily didn't get to participate in the census or did not want to do that. So are you gathering information on local level that way?
That's a great question, and I'm glad you brought it up. It's a two-part answer. The first is there's another contingent of non-data folks that are working on the community engagement piece. So there's been active community engagement happening in the community currently. And because Urban has such wonderful resources, they have something called a data walk. And so our intention for the development of our pillar is to take our data back to community and gain an understanding of it from the lived experience of the folks that are also experiencing what the data is telling us. I had one more point on, we have surveyed the community like within an inch of its life. So we're also making use of a large repository of data we put together where folks have already gone to community and already done the surveys. So we're not going and like creating survey fatigue. Like the East End has been surveyed within an inch of its life. So we're using the surveys that have already happened and analyzing those as another component of the work.
And I'll just add that, part of the component of again, the team's engagement in this particular Mobility Action Learning Network is that we have workshops every other month with all of the communities in the track. And this one that's coming up next week is focused on basically what does it look like to engage community in this decision-making around what data needs, like how to prioritize data, not just collect data. And I really loved Frank's point earlier in his presentation around and then being accountable back to community about what that data is saying, what they're finding, and like where are there places to do that. So one, I think there's really strong plans here, and there is a really great connection to how other communities are thinking about this, and that is a fundamental principle of the Upward Mobility Framework is just what you said. It's not just one data source, it's not just quantitative data, there's a qualitative data component, and there's a, again, accountability to community data.
I'm just going to lift up what Elizabeth was mentioning about, Isabel was mentioning about the Virginia Community Engagement Index. There's a lot of work being done to get out in the community and not only collect data, not only share it back, but then to empower people to use voice, to use that data, but also to engage on a regular basis, because to your point, we're going to miss data points all the time. There is no perfect data set out there. Right? Anybody who tells you that there is, 5 out of 4 people will misuse data on a regular basis. So you need to have people who are comfortable and active in engaging with, not be afraid of the numbers, not be afraid of who's gonna use what, who's gonna do what with this data, but to advocate for themselves and create the most robust opportunities for change that we can create.
I'm gonna check in with my timekeepers in the back. How are we looking? 2 minutes. All right, last question. No pressure.
Great, thank you all so much. I was curious, so sometimes when I'm looking at the data in the presentation, it includes Petersburg, sometimes it doesn't include Petersburg. So I'm with Petersburg, and I'm curious if for the next effort, when we go forward with this mobility initiative, is Petersburg gonna be considered in the analysis?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And I understand you might have seen some of our housing data with the Tri-Cities included and sometimes not. And we are aware and we are also confused. As a PlanRVA entity, we have a specific footprint. We are answerable to this stakeholder group here. At the same time, as a researcher, we see the Tri-Cities, even Dinwiddie and surrounding areas, as an extension of the region, because if we have seen that as Richmond's housing prices went up and people started moving, they moved to Hopewell, they moved to Dinwiddie. We know that flow is happening. That is important to us. We are still undecided. Are we gonna keep our PlanRVA footprint, extend to some of Greater or all of Greater? I'm sorry, I don't have a simple
But I will also add, because Saren's done incredible GIS data work on food access for the Petersburg region, and United Way and the Community Foundation fund in Petersburg and the Tri-Cities area. So it might not be a part of the regional framework yet, but there's plenty of activity from our agencies that support the Petersburg.
It mostly depends on who is behind that project. So Community Foundation's footprint extends to the Tri-Cities. In that case, if we are helping them understand some issues, the Tri-Cities are gonna get included. And that's why you saw Tri-Cities in the housing map, not in the other maps. And that thing is gonna change. We are learning from experience as we build our dashboards. You might have seen all of our dashboards look slightly different from one another because they follow a progressive path. Because we started with one version, we didn't like it, we changed something, we again didn't like it, we changed something, and we are basically maturing into it. So depending on the projects, we will insist that. Barb, if I have 2 minutes, two is the standard unit of ask. I have one question for Alexis. I wanted to highlight this because I think it's important to our constituents here. So the mobility framework, I know there are various counties and cities and regions who have adopted. Can you highlight how that framework is being, because we have urban areas and rural areas, and issues are sometimes similar, sometimes very different. I want to know, I want you to highlight a little bit on how those localities have adopted, how urban versus rural, how it is useful in both settings. Sorry about
So you asked for 2 minutes, which means I have 1 minute to answer that very big question. So I'd say with a lot of things, there are limitations. So one of the limitations of our mobility metrics is that we have data available for every county in the US. And we learned a lot about, when we started engaging with Richmond, about one of the challenges of the governance structure of Virginia when it comes to cities and counties. And then cities, of over 75,000, which rules out a lot of communities, both rural and just in suburban and just not large. So I don't think I have a good answer for anyone that's come up with a solution. I have really enjoyed working with Rochester, New York. There's something called the Rochester Monroe Anti-Poverty Initiative, who adopted the framework very, very early, just on their own independently, and now they're a part of this network as well. And it's the ongoing struggle, right? It's the challenge of
political boundaries that don't match, the reality of the way people live, the way our environment works, the way that everything sort of happens. So I think they're a good one and I think this effort, right, that's bringing in multiple people from multiple geographies, multiple political, multiple private sector and nonprofit sector, to come together to come up with these challenges. Interesting, we have conversations with all of these communities across the United States as a part of this, and every single one is like, housing, man, we gotta figure something out. Who's figured it out? And I'm like, if somebody had figured it out, we would all know, because they would be making so much money sharing the solution with everybody. And so I do think, to the question about what's the result of the pandemic, I think there's some opportunity still for us to kind of remember what it was like when we all had to initially go in our houses and be by ourselves and be disconnected from everybody, to like swing back into what does connection look like. I'm getting philosophical here, but I think that's really important. So I think there are communities that are looking at that. One of the communities in the track, Providence, Rhode Island, has a really interesting approach. They are starting at the neighborhood level, not just census tract, but kind of what their neighborhoods are. But they've done this really strong commitment to community advisory boards. They're called something else. And when we started having these conversations, they were like, well, we're gonna draft something, but we can't make any decisions till we go back to the community. And that was just their innate initial response. And I think there's something there when we talk about what are these boundaries. All that to say, with the housing example, there are the things that are the pressures, whether you're rural or urban, are still happening, and things need to be contextualized at your individual level with the community that is there, and empowering them to kind of figure out how they want to implement solutions. But generally, I think we're more alike than we're different, and we just sometimes fall into the differences because it's easier. But again, not a great example.
Thank you.
You're helping us figure that out. So y'all are gonna be the example next year when we talk to people.
So there's a lot to take away from the conversation and the questions today, but I hope that you take away one piece of thought and one piece of action, and that is this collective is on the move, but this collective is on the move in the very beginning, and they are co-creating it with community in its broadest definition, which includes this community, it includes residents, it includes nonprofits and faith institutions and civic associations. And so please, as you walk out of this room, stay engaged, make suggestions, be curious, be critical, be supportive, and spread the word. And the contact information for everybody on this panel is in that presentation. So use email, use phone, come to our offices, and keep talking about it as we build it out. Join me in thanking our 4 panelists today.
No, you're good. I'm gonna do it on my phone.